Hi, everyone. My name is Sonja van Dichelen, and I'm the Deputy Director of the Sydney Southeast Asia Centre here at the University of Sydney. I'd like to welcome you all to this first session of the Politics in Action series for 2023. Politics in Action is the flagship event of the Sydney Southeast Asia Centre, and across the next 2 days, we will have political updates from Singapore, Cambodia, Indonesia, Thailand, Timor-Leste, and the Philippines. Before I introduce our first speaker, the team and I at the Sydney Southeast Asia Centre would like to acknowledge and pay respect to the traditional owners of the land on which we are Zooming our sessions in, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. It's upon their ancestral lands that the University of Sydney is built. As we share our knowledge, may we also pay respect to the knowledge embedded forever within the Aboriginal custodianship of country. We pay our respects to those who have cared and continue to care for country. Now, I'm delighted to moderate this very first session on Singapore, and will shortly introduce our speaker, but wanted to give you a quick rundown of the format. So speakers have about 20 minutes to give an overview of the political situation in the country. We will then have about 10 minutes to ask questions, which you can do via the Q&A function. So feel free to place your questions throughout the session, and I will collect the questions for discussion. We will also be live streaming the event on Facebook, so you can follow the event there if you encounter any issues with Zoom. Now, finally, I'm so pleased to be introducing to you our speaker, Dr. Walid Jumblat Abdullah, who has kindly accepted our invitation to present an update on politics in Singapore. Dr. Abdullah is Assistant Professor at the Nanyang Technological University and is joining us straight from Singapore, where he runs the Public Policy and Global Affairs program. You can find his full bio on our website, but I did want to highly recommend his video podcast, Teh Tarik with Walid, where he interviews politicians and political influencers. If you want an intimate and highly engaging insight into Singaporean politics, that's really now the go-to place. So please, Walid, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Sonia. Good morning, everyone, from where I am. Thanks, Sonia, for that kind, maybe exaggerated introduction. Hopefully, she didn't set the expectations too high. So today I'll be trying to speak on contemporary updates, yes, on Singapore politics. So basically thinking about what has happened in the past year and past 3 months, past 5 months, 4.5, and what's gonna happen moving ahead. But I really wanted to also draw bigger, wider lessons or trends from what we've experienced so far in the past year and maybe beyond, and then try to project and think about the bigger picture rather than just 2022 or 2023 itself. So I've chosen 3 main things to talk about because I think this will serve the purpose of zooming out and talking about the broader lessons or broader trends, broader possible trajectories, right? And the first would be what has been settled in the past year, maybe 10 months or so especially, which is the leadership transition, which is the confirmation of DPM Lawrence Wong as Prime Minister in waiting, and what that portends for Singapore. Secondly, the Committee of Privileges fallout, and I'll explain what has happened in the past. This stretches back 2 years, and we still have not experienced, we still have not come to a conclusion on what's going to happen to the Workers' Party individuals involved. And finally, there is going to be an election this year. Now, this election is not consequential. It's not super consequential in the grander scheme of things because ours is a modified Westminster system. So the president is the head of state, not the head of government. But nonetheless, it points towards voting trends for the general elections, which will happen in the next couple of years. Or at least it can. It can, depending on a few factors, which I will explain as well. All right. So I think the biggest, and all three, of course, are interrelated, but the biggest one would be the biggest development would be DPM Lawrence Wong now, and a lot of people have said this DPM Lawrence Wong. A lot of people have said that this heralds a new era for PAP politics, right? And of course, it does because we've only had 3 prime ministers so far. So any new prime minister, it will be a new era in some way, right? So it does. But whether will we witness significant changes to the PAP's approach to policy making? A lot of people were saying yes, we'll see. And so, of course, in the mass media, which was generally fawning about his selection as a prime minister in waiting, but also online. So activists, some younger people were saying, "Oh, he's so relatable. He has his own TikTok. He's quite a star on TikTok." So, will we witness significant changes to the PAP's approach to policy making? I think that's a valid question to ask, right? And he's relatively young. He comes from a non-elite school. He wasn't from Raffles, the top educational institution in Singapore, at least pre-tertiary. He was from Tanjong Katong Secondary School, which is not exactly neighborhood, but not exactly elite as well. And he seems like he has a different approach and demeanor to him, a softer, gentler approach to him. So my argument is broadly, we will not witness a huge change in PAP's policy making, even though DPM Wong will be taking over a new generation of leaders. They call the 4th generation, the 4G leadership. I think the PAP will move left socially and economically, as it already has been over the past few years. I think economically, there is no doubt that the PAP, the leftward shift is gradual, but it's happening. So you see more efforts towards more redistribution of wealth, for instance. Maybe slight increases in income tax or corporate tax, which for the longest time, the PAP has been saying this is not feasible and so on. But you've seen gradual shifts. Even a version of the minimum wage, the progressive wage model, it has been implemented. And we talk about things like unemployment insurance nowadays and things which were no-go 20 years ago. But this wasn't because of Lawrence Wong. This has started under PM Lee Hsien Loong, and it's slowly, I would say maybe 2011, after the elections, you saw a gradual shift economically leftwards. So I think that will be here to stay. And as we all know, the political science literature is also replete with this. Once something is given, it's much harder to take it back, as opposed to not giving something at all. So this trend, I have very little doubt that the leftward shift economically will continue to happen under DPM Wong. And socially as well, you see more relaxations towards previous, you can say, social taboos, or a shift in societal norms and the government reacting to this. For instance, the anti-gay sex law, which was on the cards but wasn't enforced, Section 377A. It has been repealed. It was repealed recently at end of last year. It was announced during the National Day rally in 2022, and it was repealed. So, and there has been more overtures towards the LGBT community, towards social liberals, and you can see that even in the realm of gender, women's rights, there has been a strengthening in that regard. Of course, still more can be done, but you can definitely see the PAP moving left socially, right? Becoming more inclusive in that regard, right? However, I argue that politically it will remain where it is. And what exactly? I mean, it's a very strange way to phrase this entire thing, right? So moving left socially and economically, but not politically. But basically, I would say that politically, I do not expect a drastic opening up of the space. I think things will remain where they are, and in fact, there may be signs that the PAP would tighten the ship and try to consolidate power more. And the main reason for this is we really need to look at the PAP as an institution, right? So not about personalities. Personalities, in fact, of course, personalities always matter. They always matter in politics. But ultimately, what matters the most is our institutions, right? That's what matters the most. And specifically, the institution in question, I would say, is a PAP's party structure, right? So the PAP is a closed party, it's a cadre party where the PAP chooses you, you don't choose the PAP, right? So the PAP chooses its cadres. The Central Executive Committee is then chosen by the cadres, right? So the CEC chooses the cadres choose the CEC. So this is what a journalist described before as the Pope choosing the cardinals choosing the Pope, right? That's the institution that the PAP uses, the structure that the PAP uses. And most importantly, there is no leadership contest. So leaders are selected and they are not elected. Now, what this means, this is perhaps the PAP's biggest strength, because the PAP reproduces itself ideologically. Splits are less likely to happen. And if they do happen, it won't be along ideological lines. It'll be along personal lines, right? So unlike in other countries where there are leadership contests and there will be factions, and it's a mass party when anyone can join. And then you'll have people with radically different ideologies joining as well. You do not get that in the PAP, which is why for me, when people were asking, oh, who would be a better prime minister for Singapore before it was settled? Is it going to be Lawrence Wong or Chan Chun Sing, who's the Minister of Education, or Ong Ye Kung? They were the top three candidates. And I said, it really doesn't matter, because all of them broadly have similar political philosophies. If they didn't, they wouldn't be in the upper echelons of the ruling party. So I'm really trying to move away from this, no doubt, an important development, DPM Lawrence Wong becoming prime minister. But I'm trying to move away from that and say that we need to look at the bigger picture, which is a PAP's party structure. It will ensure that people who rise to the top are mostly similar thinking. As I said, this is the main reason why there has been no major split in the party since independence, which is remarkable for competitive authoritarian states to have parties which are unified as the PAP, that is almost exceptional. Then the leftward shift, as I said, it's not in areas pertaining to its core legitimacy, right? So especially in terms of political control, in terms of race and religion, I do not foresee a drastic opening up. And when there are shifts on this, I would say it would come, or it must come, from external sources rather than an imaginary reformist from within, right? And because, as I said, DPM Wong and even the others in the 4G, they are ideologically similar to their predecessors, right? And for the PAP, that is what has worked so far. Why should they change on? If there's no demand, there won't be supply, right? So which is why, if there are shifts on this, it's going to come from external demand rather than from internal change. So they are moving leftwards economically, but not politically. This is what my co-author and I, Pravin Prakash, we term as calibrated liberalization, where we say that the PAP liberalizes, but in an extremely calibrated way and not on issues which pertain to its core legitimacy, especially on political control, right? Now, and a taste of DPM Lawrence Wong as the Prime Minister in waiting, right? Just recently, a couple of weeks ago, when he was talking to the opposition in Parliament, and he said, we ask that you be upfront about the realities and trade-offs we face as a nation and be honest about your plans, policies, and intentions. And DPM Wong was saying that the opposition shouldn't be populist and so on. Now, the term populist is bandied about so much these days. Everyone knows, right? It's the go-to insult against a political opponent, so much so that it really doesn't mean anything on a lot of occasions in which the term is used, right? And so I wouldn't put too much stock in that. But this particular statement, right? I find that this is reminiscent of previous prime ministers as well and what they have been saying, right? So standard, political talk towards the opposition, be upfront about the realities and trade-offs, and that's fine, I think, and plans and policies. But intentions of opposition, right? I find this fascinating, right? Because this has always been the case. When there's disagreements with the PAP, usually the question is, oh, what's your intention? What's your intention? You need to tell us what's your intention. Instead of we all agree that we all want the best for Singapore, but we disagree on the path to get to where we are, right? But there's always a question of what is your intention? If you disagree with us, what is your intention, right? And I find, of course, obviously for me, I mean, this isn't something that I would never say to somebody if they disagree with me, unless I have further evidence, right? If they disagree with me, what's your intention? I want to know what your intention. I'll just assume that we both have similar intentions. We want the best for Singapore, but we may disagree on the means, right? So this questioning of this is just a couple of weeks ago, right? It's reminiscent of what has happened in the past with other previous PAP leaders. And for me, this is evidence that you can see that when it comes to political control, when it comes to approach to the opposition, the PAP under DPM Lawrence Wong will largely remain the same. And I go back to the institutionalist explanation. As a political scientist, I think that's a more compelling explanation rather than based on different personalities and temperaments. And that's the most important development. I just quickly run through the other one. So what happened was the former WP MP, she told a lie in parliament, and it was established, it was clearly a lie about some personal experience of hers. I'll be happy to share more during the Q&A, but I'll just breeze through this because that's not the point of this slide. But basically, she had to resign. And then the Committee of Privileges was formed, and it was to investigate this lie. But instead, the committee was more focused on how the WP leaders, whether they were complicit in the lie, whether they knew, when they knew, what did they do, and so on, right? And I think for sure, no doubt, that this incident, it didn't help the WP, because the WP, I mean, there are questions, right? There are legitimate questions. When did the WP leaders know about this? What did they do about this? There was a time lag between both times that she lied in parliament and the time that she admitted that she lied. At the same time, the Committee of Privileges, it was televised and especially online, and you can see that public sentiment also started shifting. Especially there was this exchange between Minister Edwin Tong and the leader of the opposition, Pritam Singh, where it was seen as extremely contentious. And you could see online sentiment also shifting. Now, I don't know for sure where online sentiment is at, and that's the point I will move to in the next slide. I don't know for sure, but I could definitely sense a shift when initially people were really upset at the WP, even people who were on the fence or not really pro-government, but they had questions, legitimate questions about the WP. But then when they saw that the minister was too harsh on the leader of the opposition, and then people saw that, okay, maybe this is not the approach we want as well, right? So now the question is, how far would the investigations go? What would the outcome of the police investigations be? And what will be the reaction by the people to that, right? Because in 2020, what we saw was during the elections, when the PAP went too harsh against the opposition, there was a backlash, especially by the younger generation in terms of the voting. And this was acknowledged by the PAP as well. So what will happen this time, right? And brings me to the next point, the presidential election. It could be a harbinger of things to come. Now, 2017 was controversial. The last time we had the presidential election, or we were supposed to have, because it was reserved for a Malay. And many people felt, and the government has acknowledged that many people felt it was to exclude Tan Cheng Bock. I think Minister Shanmugam acknowledged it. Although, of course, they deny it. They said this is to ensure that we have minority representation. Now, some questions to consider, right? Who will be the PAP endorsed candidate? Because the PAP always, usually is a informally endorses a candidate. who will be the challengers, if any, because the bar to entry is really high, so you may not be contesting. You may not have any potential challenges, and the other one is how will the public vote if there is a vote? Because I think this is really interesting, because even though, as I said, the presidency itself may not be super significant in the grander scheme of things, but the election could tell us where the public sentiment is and what are the issues that matter to them, right? And over the past year, I would say there are two main issues that could affect voting patterns for the PAP adversely. Two main issues, and they have tried to manage one especially. So one is on the material front, and that is housing prices. This is the biggest debate, public housing prices, biggest debate in Singapore politics today. The other is the non-material front, which is whether the trend of 2020 will continue, whether the concerns of justice, where younger people especially seem to be rejecting high-handed tactics against the opposition. Now, this was acknowledged in the book, an excellent book by Dr. Shashi Jayakumar. I recommend, A History of the PAP. I believe it's a 2021 or 2022 book. I think it was published by NUS Press. He acknowledged that in 2020, for the first time, you saw something different in the voting patterns, especially younger people. They were averse to what they seemed as unfair tactics or unfair accusations towards the opposition. Again, this is all about perception. Perception is reality in politics, right? So, and it doesn't seem that the PAP has changed in this regard. So will the voting patterns continue, right? And that's something that we need to, I think, monitor, especially depending on what's the fallout from the Committee of Privileges, how the police will conclude their investigations and so on, how the public will accept the outcome of that investigation. I'll just conclude with this, right? So I think the larger structures of politics remain intact, and I think we shouldn't really put too much stock into a new prime minister coming. As long as those larger structure of politics remain intact, I think the party's structure will remain so for the longest time, and therefore you can expect that ideologically the party will continue to reproduce itself. If change happens, it will be from without, not from within. And I think after GE 2020, the day after, Minister Shanmugam, who's a stalwart in the party, right, one of the most important people in the party, he said that the PAP will engage in soul searching, and have things changed? And I said in some ways they have, but it's not really a change. It's a continuation of what has continued before, especially socially and economically. But politically, I don't think much has changed. Now, the question is whether would the movements on the economics and social front be enough to offset whatever unhappiness people have on the political front. And that's a question we do not know the answer to that question, but I would think that's an important question for us to think about. And I think 2023 itself will not be too crucial in the grander scheme of things, unless there is a snap election, parliamentary election, right? But it will point towards important trends, right? How the PAP behaves towards the opposition this year, how the opposition behaves in parliament, right? And whether the opposition will prove itself to be a worthy opponent, or whether they would shoot themselves in the foot. And especially the presidential election, what will happen there, right? So I think that's all I have for now. I'll be happy to take any questions. So over to you, Sonia.
Thank you so much, Walid, for this very clear and concise presentation, a really good update of politics in Singapore. Thank you very much. And thank you so much for keeping with the time. It's exactly 20 minutes. So thank you for that, Walid. So I'm opening it up for questions. And we've got a couple of them here. There's one from Paul. Will there be a pushback against the perceived double standards for not going after the Deputy Speaker under the Committee of Privileges for voting on a motion that potentially had a direct impact on himself? The change in the maximum fine disqualifying an MP.
Yeah, so Professor Tambaya, of course, he's in the scene, and he would. I think that the questioner is better positioned to answer the question than the person who's been questioned. My view as an analyst is probably not on this specific point. I don't think this specific point is something that many Singaporeans are talking about, or even know, to be honest. Not on this specific point. But I think in terms, if there is going to be a pushback or a backlash, it's going to be because of what people saw, and that's specifically the exchange between Minister Edwin Tong and leader of opposition Pritam Singh. I think it's going to be that, and it's going to be about the general point of, I think people do not, especially younger people, they want to see more fairness in the electoral scene. So any perceived unfairness will happen. So it's not on this specific point. I don't think there will be pushback on this, but if there's pushback, it's going to be on the broader point.
Then we'll have another question. What are your thoughts on PSP's brand of politics? How will the electorate buy into this kind of politics, especially in the next general election?
Yeah, okay. So the Progress Singapore Party, they would maybe in the more traditional political science definition, you can say that they are more of a populist party than I don't think the WP is a populist party, but PSP would be. By the way, I mean populist is a neutral term. It's not you can put a value to it, but it's a neutral term, right? So Bernie Sanders is a populist as well, right? AOC is a populist. So when I find myself, I am definitely a fan of Bernie Sanders. So I'm not saying this in a derogatory manner, right? But I would say PSP is more populist, and the PSP folks have been very kind to me. They always accept my invitations to Teh Tarik with Walid. So I have really, I have personally nothing against them. What I would say is I do sometimes fear the rhetoric that is being used when it comes to immigrants. I do think that, not that the PSP is xenophobic, I do not say that about them, and I do not think they are. But some of the things that are said could possibly serve as fodder for xenophobes. Although I don't think that's on them, right? If somebody is xenophobic, it's on the xenophobe itself, not on the people who may be perceived to have provided fodder for them. So I personally disagree with their policies and proposals, right? Now, at the same time, I know for a fact that many Singaporeans agree with them and disagree with me on this. So I'm far more pro-immigration than I think. So on this, I am much closer to the PAP's policies and stances than the PSP. And I think even many of my family members, the thing that really upsets them is the PAP's immigration policy. So I disagree with, my family members disagree with me on this. And I find that the PSP stance cannot be dismissed easily, because I think many Singaporeans, and I think that's why the PAP always takes pains to go and refute these stances, even though the PSP only has two non-constituency members of parliament. But the PAP goes through great lengths to refute them, because I think they understand that people are attracted to that, even though I personally am not.
Thanks, Walid. So the next question is, what are the existential threats that the PAP perceive going forward for the party elections and for the nation?
Right. So the standard existential threats will always be there, I think, and this is the core ideology of the PAP and of Singapore, and I think rightly so, is vulnerability. It's a small nation. Small nations are intrinsically irrelevant, as the government likes to say, and they are right. So externally, we are vulnerable. So Lee Kuan Yew used to say, when elephants fight, the grass suffers. When elephants make love, the grass suffers as well, right? So the small nations will always suffer, especially when it comes to US-China relations, right? But even in general, right? So I think that those threats will always remain existentially. Now, internally, also there will be similar threats in terms of how the PAP perceives multiracialism and race as primordial, and how that could potentially upend decades of progress. But one of the interesting things that the government has been quite tough on is, and last year's National Day rally, the Mandarin speech. So the National Day rally is done in 3 languages, Malay, English, and Chinese. And in the Chinese speech, and only in the Chinese speech, the government warned of foreign interference and propaganda. Now, this was, of course, the Prime Minister didn't mention the country, but this was clearly directed at China. And that is an interesting development. Now, the overall philosophy remains the same, is that Singapore must guard itself against foreign actors. So that hasn't changed, but maybe the actors in question may change, right? So maybe that's a new existential threat, but overall the philosophy of the existential threat is the same. So hopefully I answered that question.
Thanks, Walid. Okay, so I'm aware of our time. We've got 4 minutes and we've got still quite a few questions. I'm going to read out the last 3 questions. I'm afraid we can't take any more. And I'll let you, Walid, choose which one you would like to address. So the first one, do you think the recent discourse and backlash around the death penalty have an impact on how the PAP is viewed or received? Could this be different for different generations? The second one from Arun, what are your thoughts on public perceptions regarding the opposition party's ability to offer legitimate policy alternatives in Parliament? And the second part of his question is, what are your thoughts on public perception on the PAP's accusation rhetoric accusing the opposition of not providing legitimate policy alternatives? And then the last question from Thomas, is PAP's leftward economic shift or the ascension of DPM Wong to Prime Minister likely to deliver any meaningful change in Singapore's approach to energy policy? So up to you, Walid, to answer the ones that you would like to answer.
So I'll try to quickly answer all of them. So on energy policy, I'm not really an expert on this. What I would say is climate change is an area also that the PAP is okay with a lot of changes, a lot of radical changes, in fact, because that doesn't pertain to its core legitimacy. And in fact, this is one of the ways where it can really gain the trust and votes of the youth as well, right? So I would not be surprised if there is a fundamental or meaningful change here. Now, on the death penalty, I do not think that there is a lot of support publicly for the abolition of the death penalty. I do not think so. So I think this will not really affect how the PAP is viewed and received. Now, in the future, it could be the case in 10 or 20 years down the road, but I do not see that now. But the death penalty also is not really crucial to the PAP's legitimacy. They could do away with it if they wanted to, right? But I think they genuinely believe that it is beneficial to them, to the country. But I do not see that there will be a significant backlash at the polls due to the death penalty. Now, the final one on the opposition party's ability to offer legitimate policy alternatives. What I would say is, it is not true that the opposition does not have policy alternatives. They always have had. I think the SDP has a lot of policy alternatives. Prof. Tambaya is here. He would say that the WP has that as well. Well, I would say the SDP has more, and the PSP has some as well. So I don't think that's true, but that has always been the case. That has always been the accusation towards the opposition. I don't see this happening, but that's part of politics, I think. And I think over time, especially with social media, it's much harder to sell that narrative to people. Yeah, so hopefully I answer all the questions.
Thank you so much, Walid, for keeping the time and for this very productive discussion. Thanks again for an excellent presentation, and my apologies that we have to keep to this strict time. Hope you get the chance to join us, and I'm talking to the public here. Hope you get the chance to join us for our next section on Cambodia. Walid, thanks again, and thanks for joining us, everyone.
Thanks, Sonia.